The dust swirled around Silas Blackwood's polished boots, a nervous eddy in the suffocating silence of the town square. He stood on the makeshift auction block, a collection of sturdy crates, his portly frame exuding a smug authority that choked the breath from the assembled townsfolk. His gaze, like a vulture's, swept over the woman standing before him, Ilara Vance. Her dress was patched but clean, her face pale but for the twin spots of defiant color high on her cheekbones. Her hands were clasped so tightly before her they were bloodless. Behind her, unseen but palpably present in her terror, were her two small children, shadowed by the threat of starvation and a future Blackwood was all too eager to dictate. The air was thick with shame, the gazes of the townsfolk mostly downcast, fixed on the ground as if solutions might sprout from the barren earth. They were a gallery of fear, their inaction a chorus to Blackwood's cruel overture. He was foreclosing on a debt her late husband had foolishly incurred, and Ilara was the final, most valuable collateral. Blackwood cleared his throat, a sound like gravel grinding. "Well now, Ilara," he began, his voice oozing a grotesque paternalism, "the good people of Redemption have heard the terms. Your meager possessions have barely covered the interest. Your land, such as it is now mine." He paused, letting his words hang, each one a hammer blow. "But I am a man of opportunities." A greasy smile spread across his face, and his eyes roamed Ilara with a possessive glint that made several onlookers flinch. Ilara's voice, when it came, was a mere thread, yet it sliced through the oppressive quiet. Her eyes, wide and luminous with a mother's ultimate desperation, fixed on Blackwood, not with subservience, but with the raw courage of a cornered animal. "I have nothing left, Mr. Blackwood." "Nothing but myself." A tremor ran through her, but her gaze held. She said, and her voice gained a chilling clarity that echoed across the silent square, each word a shard of her dignity, "I'll serve you forever, master, if you feed my children tonight." The word master was a brand on her own soul, offered up in the most terrible bargain. The crowd stirred, a low murmur of discomfort and horror, but none moved, none spoke up. They were caught in the web of Blackwood's power, their own debts, their own fears. Blackwood's smile widened. This was better than he'd hoped. He saw not a woman, but a possession, a trophy of his dominance. His eyes flickered with a dark hunger. He was about to speak, to seal her fate with a triumphant affirmative, when another voice, unexpected and resonant, cut through the charged atmosphere. "That won't be necessary." The words were quiet, yet they carried the weight of iron. Every head turned. Standing at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed till now, was a man. He was tall, his frame lean but powerful beneath a travel-stained duster. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind and something deeper, something sorrowful. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on Blackwood, unwavering. Jedediah Thorne had seen enough. He'd ridden into Redemption seeking only water and a night's rest, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. He saw the predator in Blackwood's eyes, the profound despair in Ilara's, and a familiar, cold anger began to stir in his chest, an old fire he thought long dead. His hand, resting near the worn Colt at his hip, did not move, yet its presence was a silent promise. Silas Blackwood, momentarily stunned by the interruption, narrowed his eyes. "And who might you be, stranger, to interfere in affairs that don't concern you?" His voice was a low growl, laced with threat. Jedediah Thorne stepped forward, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the hard-packed earth. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted motion, his presence filling the space he occupied more completely than Blackwood's bluster ever could. "Name's Thorne," he said, his voice still low, yet it carried an undeniable authority. "And a woman's desperation, a child's hunger, that concerns any man worth the name." He didn't look at Ilara, not yet. His focus was entirely on Blackwood, a silent challenge that brooked no argument. "What's the debt?" Blackwood scoffed, regaining some of his arrogance. "More than a saddle tramp like you could cover in a lifetime." $500, hard cash. He named the exorbitant sum with a smirk, expecting the stranger to balk, to slink away. Jedediah's expression didn't change. He reached inside his duster, his movements unhurried, drawing out a worn leather pouch. He loosened the drawstring and, with a flick of his wrist, a cascade of gold coins, double eagles, spilled onto the dusty top of a nearby rain barrel, each one landing with a solid, definitive thud that echoed louder than any gunshot in the sudden stillness. The sound of the coins, so unexpected, so substantial, struck the crowd dumb. Blackwood's jaw, which had been set in a sneer, slackened. His eyes, wide with disbelief, darted from the gold to Jedediah's impassive face and back again. "There's your 500, Jedediah stated, his gaze unwavering. "And another 100 for the lady's trouble, and for the public humiliation you've put her through." He nudged a smaller stack forward. "Count it." The silence stretched, taut and brittle. Blackwood, for the first time, looked uncertain. Greed warred with fury in his eyes. To refuse the gold now, in front of the entire town, would be to admit his motives were baser than mere debt collection. To accept it was to concede defeat to this quiet, formidable stranger. He licked his lips, his eyes darting to his two thuggish enforcers, who shifted uneasily under Jedediah's cool regard. They seemed far less imposing now. With a snarl, Blackwood gestured for one of his men. "Count it, you fools." While the coins were being tallied, Jedediah finally turned his gaze to Elara. She was staring at him, her expression a mixture of profound shock, disbelief, and a dawning, fragile hope. Her lips were parted, but no words came. He saw the faint tremor in her hands, the exhaustion that clung to her like a shroud. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He said, his voice softer now, "Seems your debt is paid." He scooped the 100 he'd set aside and pressed the coins into her trembling hand, his fingers briefly brushing hers. Her skin was cold. "This should see to your children." For a while Elara finally found her voice, a whisper. Why would you do this?" Her eyes searched his, looking for a trick, a hidden price. Jedediah's gaze flickered, a shadow passing through their depths. "Let's just say I don't hold with bullies." He turned back as Blackwood, his face a mask of barely controlled rage, confirmed the count. "The debt is settled, Blackwood. She's free of you." Blackwood snatched the pouch. "This ain't over, stranger," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Redemption ain't big enough for men who stick their noses where they ain't welcome." Jedediah met his glare. "Then maybe you should think about leaving." Without another word to Blackwood, Jedediah offered his arm to Elara. "If you'll allow me, I'll see you and your children to somewhere safe. The hotel, perhaps? Get them something warm to eat." Elara hesitated for only a moment, then, with a gratitude that shone through her fear, she took his arm. The townsfolk parted silently as they walked away, leaving Blackwood fuming, his victory turned to ash, his authority profoundly challenged. The quiet stranger had bought more than a debt. He'd bought a sliver of hope for a woman and her children, and in doing so, had sown the seeds of a storm that was far from over. He led her to the small, reasonably clean eatery attached to the general store, the scent of stew and fresh bread a welcome change from the dust and despair of the square. Elara's two children, Lily, perhaps 7, with her mother's wide, haunted eyes, and Tom, a boy of 5, his small face smudged with dirt and silent worry, emerged from the alley where their mother had hidden them. They clung to Elara's skirt, their gazes fixed on Jedediah with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He ordered them bowls of the thickest stew, milk, and bread, watching as they ate with a quiet intensity, their initial apprehension slowly giving way to the simple, urgent need of empty bellies being filled. He said little, his presence a shield, his silence more comforting than any platitude. The townsfolk whispered, their eyes following him, this man who had materialized from nowhere with a fortune in gold and a core of steel. Who was Jedediah Thorne? And what storm had he truly brought to redemption? Silas Blackwood did not take defeat gracefully. Humiliation curdled into a venomous rage within him, a dark bile that promised retribution. He was a man accustomed to power, to bending others to his will through fear and economic strangulation. Jedediah Thorne's quiet defiance was an intolerable affront, a spark that threatened to ignite the tinder of resentment smoldering beneath the surface of redemption. Blackwood owned the saloon, the largest land holdings, and held the mortgages of half the businesses in town, including the timid Sheriff Miller's small ranch. His influence was a suffocating blanket. He began by spreading whispers, poisonous insinuations about Thorne. Was he a road agent, flush with stolen gold? A deserter? A hired gun with some nefarious purpose? Fear was Blackwood's most trusted tool. He instructed his enforcers, a brutish pair named Cletus and Jeb, to make Thorn's presence in Redemption uncomfortable. They loitered outside the small room Jedediah had taken at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, their leering gazes and muttered threats designed to intimidate. Mrs. Henderson, a widow with a kind face and a spine forged in hardship, offered Jedediah quiet support, an extra blanket, a pot of coffee left on the stove. She'd seen too much of Blackwood's cruelty. "He's a viper, Mr. Thorn," she warned him one evening, her voice low as she cleared his supper dishes. "And vipers strike when cornered." Jedediah merely nodded, his eyes thanking her for the counsel. "I'm aware." His quiet vigilance was constant. He accompanied Elara and her children when they went to the general store for supplies, his presence a silent deterrent to any overt harassment. He noticed the townsfolk, who had initially avoided Elara, now offered hesitant nods, a shared glance of sympathy. A small crack was appearing in the wall of fear Blackwood had built. One evening, as Jedediah walked back from checking on the horse he'd stabled, Cletus and Jeb blocked his path in a narrow alleyway. The moon cast long, menacing shadows. "Mr. Blackwood wants a word with you, Thorn," Cletus sneered, cracking his knuckles. "Says you've overstayed your welcome." Jedediah stopped, his body relaxed but ready. His eyes, though shadowed by his hat brim, seemed to absorb the dim light, holding a chilling stillness. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, his voice even. "But I don't run from it either." Jeb, emboldened by their numbers, lunged with a clumsy fist. Jedediah moved with a speed that belied his calm demeanor. He didn't draw his gun. A swift block, a precisely aimed strike to Jeb's throat that sent him gasping to his knees, and a disabling twist of Cletus's extended arm that ended with the man howling, his wrist bent at an unnatural angle. It was over in seconds. Jedediah looked down at the whimpering Cletus. "Tell Blackwood," he said, his voice like chipped flint, "to send a man next time, not boys." He stepped over Jeb and continued on his way, leaving them to nurse their wounds and their shattered bravado. The incident, quickly whispered through town, only deepened the mystery surrounding him. Later that night, Elara found him sitting on the porch of the boarding house, staring out at the stardusted prairie. She had mended a tear in young Tom's only shirt and brought Jedediah a cup of coffee. She sat quietly beside him for a moment. "They say you handled Cletus and Jeb without breaking a sweat," she said softly. He took the coffee, his fingers brushing hers. "They were clumsy. You're not, though," she observed. "You move like a soldier." He didn't answer immediately, sipping the coffee. The silence stretched, filled only by the chirping of crickets. He carried a weight, she could see it in the lines around his eyes, in the way he held himself, as if braced for a blow that had already fallen long ago. On his rough-hewn bedside table, beside a worn Bible, lay a small, tarnished silver locket. Elara had glimpsed it once when Mrs. Henderson was tidying his room. She hadn't pried, but the image stayed with her. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper, not looking at her but at some distant point in the darkness. "I had a family once. A wife, Sarah, and 2 children. A girl, Martha, and a boy, little Caleb." His voice caught, just for an instant, a raw edge of pain exposed. "Fever took them. Swept through our valley like a wildfire. There was a man, a charlatan, selling promises of a cure. Took our money, gave us nothing but false hope. By the time we knew better, it was too late." He paused, the silence heavy with unspoken grief. "I stood by. Watched them fade. I didn't fight hard enough for them, not against the sickness, not against the lies." His hand clenched unconsciously around the coffee cup, the knuckles white. The air grew cold around them, despite the mild night. "I wasn't there to protect them when it mattered most. I see their faces." He trailed off, the admission hanging raw and exposed in the night air. Elara's heart ached for him. She saw it then, the source of his quiet strength, his fierce protectiveness. It wasn't just abstract morality, it was atonement. He was trying to silence the ghosts of his past by saving her and her children from a different kind of predator. "You couldn't have known," she whispered, her voice thick with empathy. "You can't blame yourself for a sickness." Jedediah finally turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a profound, weary sadness that mirrored her own past losses. Maybe not for the sickness, but for not seeing the wolf in sheep's clothing sooner. For not standing up when a stand needed to be taken. Some things a man carries. He looked away again, towards the vast, indifferent darkness. Blackwood, he said, his voice regaining its steel, is the same kind of wolf. Thinks he can prey on the weak, take what he wants. His wrong. Ilara reached out, her hand gently covering his. A simple touch, conveying understanding, shared sorrow, and a budding, fierce loyalty. You're not alone in this fight, Jedediah. He looked at her hand on his, then into her eyes, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than pain and vigilance warmed his gaze. It was the faintest stirring of connection, a shared burden making the load a fraction lighter. The storm Blackwood was brewing was indeed coming, but Jedediah Thorne would not face it alone, and this time, he was determined the outcome would be different. Blackwood's fury, already a potent force, escalated into a dangerous obsession. The public humiliation, the physical trouncing of his men, and now the growing, quiet admiration some townsfolk held for Thorne, it was all a corrosive acid eating away at his authority. He would not be undone by a drifter and a penniless widow. He decided that direct, overwhelming force was the only language Thorne would understand. He sent riders to his outlying ranches, summoning the roughest hands on his payroll, men whose loyalty was bought with liquor and blood money. Redemption was about to learn who truly held the reins. Word of Blackwood's preparation spread like wildfire through the anxious town. Sheriff Miller, a man whose badge was more ornament than authority, wrung his hands and pleaded with Jedediah to leave. His gatherin's a war party, Thorne. There's no standing against him. Take the woman and kids and ride out while you still can. It's for their sake. Jedediah listened patiently, his expression unreadable. And what about the next family Blackwood decides to ruin, Sheriff? Or the one after that, he asked quietly. Running only postpones the reckoning. A Miller flushed, shame warring with his fear. He had no answer. Jedediah knew the confrontation was inevitable. He wasn't a man to seek violence, but the peace he craved seemed perpetually out of reach, always demanding a price he was weary of paying, yet always willing to meet. He found Ilara by the small creek behind the boarding house, where Lily and Tom were trying to catch minnows with a piece of string and a bent pin. Her face was etched with worry, but her hands were busy mending a shirt for Tom, a small, defiant act of normalcy in the face of impending chaos. He's coming for us, isn't he? She asked, not looking up from her needlework. Her voice was steady. Jedediah nodded. Tonight, I reckon. Or first light. He watched the children for a moment, their innocent play a stark contrast to the darkness gathering. I want you to take the children, Ilara. Mrs. Henderson has a root cellar, sturdy and hidden. You'll be safe there. Ilara finally looked up, her eyes meeting his, clear and resolute. And you, Jedediah? Where will you be? I'll be where he expects me to be, he said simply. Drawing his fire. No, she said, a new strength in her voice. We faced him once for our lives. We won't hide while you fight our battle alone. This is our home, what little of it there is. These are our children. If Blackwood wants them, he has to come through both of us. Jedediah saw the fierce determination in her eyes, the resilience he had recognized from the start, now fully ignited. She was no longer just a victim, she was a woman defending her own. He felt a profound respect and a painful echo of the partner he had lost. It'll be dangerous, Ilara. Living under Blackwood's shadow is dangerous, she countered. At least this way, we fight for a chance at something better. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and blood red, Blackwood and his dozen riders thundered into the north end of Redemption's main street. They were a grim procession, armed with rifles and a palpable air of menace. The townsfolk, who had gathered in nervous clusters, scattered, doors slamming, windows shuttering. The street emptied, leaving only the swirling dust and the oppressive silence. Jedediah stood in the middle of that street, a solitary figure near the horse trough in front of the silent general store. He wasn't hiding. He held a Winchester rifle, its barrel resting lightly in the crook of his arm. Ilara was not beside him, but he knew where she was. She had insisted on her own role, a role that played to her strengths, her knowledge of the town's back ways. Blackwood reined in his horse, his face a mask of triumphant malice. "Thorn! I knew you were too stupid to run. I'm here to reclaim what's mine, starting with the woman and her brats, and then I'm going to teach this town a lesson about respecting authority." His men fanned out, their rifles glinting in the fading light. "This is your last chance, Blackwood." Jedediah's voice was calm, carrying clearly in the stillness. "Ride out. Leave these people in peace." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Peace? There'll be peace when you're 6 feet under." He raised his hand, about to give the order to fire. In that instant, a lantern flared to life in the window of the abandoned smithy down the street. Then another in the bakery. And another in the dressmaker's shop. One by one, lights appeared, small acts of defiance. And then, figures. Mrs. Henderson, holding an old shotgun, stood on her porch. Mr. Abernathy, the usually timid storekeeper, appeared in his doorway, a hunting rifle in his hands. Even Sheriff Miller, his face pale but set, stepped out from his office, his Colt drawn. They weren't an army, but they were no longer a cowardly crowd. Elara, using her knowledge of the interconnected back rooms and alleys, had rallied them, appealing not to their courage, which was scarce, but to their decency, which had been buried. She had reminded them that Blackwood's tyranny affected them all, that Thorn was fighting for a principle they had forgotten. And as Blackwood's men hesitated, their eyes darting nervously at the unexpected resistance, however meager, Jedediah raised his Winchester. The first shot was not his. It came from the shadows near the livery, Elara, with an old but accurate squirrel rifle, clipping the hat from the head of Blackwood's closest man. The fight exploded. Gunfire erupted, shattering the twilight. Jedediah moved with deadly precision, taking cover, returning fire, his shots aimed to disable, not to kill, but with lethal intent if pressed. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, a stark contrast to the panicked, wild firing of Blackwood's men, who were now caught in a crossfire, however sporadic. Elara, moving from window to window, her shots carefully placed, created chaos and confusion among Blackwood's ranks. The townsfolk, emboldened by Jedediah's stand and Elara's courage, added their own sporadic fire, mostly inaccurate but adding to the din and the sense that Blackwood was no longer facing one man, but a community, however fractured. Blackwood, enraged and desperate, spurred his horse forward, firing wildly at Jedediah. A bullet tore through Jedediah's left arm, spinning him, but he stayed on his feet, his jaw tight with pain. He brought his rifle up, sighting down the barrel at the charging tyrant. His shot was true. Blackwood cried out, clutching his shoulder, his pistol falling from his grasp as he slumped forward, then tumbled from his horse into the dust. His remaining men, seeing their leader fall and facing a town that had finally found its voice, lost their nerve. Some threw down their weapons, others turned and fled into the gathering darkness. The gunfire sputtered and died. Silence descended, heavy and ringing. Jedediah stood, breathing heavily, his arm bleeding freely, the Winchester still ready. Elara rushed to his side, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "Jedediah, you're hit." The townsfolk slowly emerged, their initial fear replaced by a stunned disbelief, then a rising tide of elation. Sheriff Miller, his hand surprisingly steady, approached the groaning Blackwood and disarmed him fully. "Silas Blackwood," Miller said, his voice gaining a timbre of authority he hadn't possessed an hour before, "you're under arrest. For attempted murder, incitement to riot, hell, for just being you the spell was broken." The tyrant had fallen, not just to one man's bullet, but to the collective courage he had so long despised. The dust began to settle, carrying with it the acrid smell of gunpowder and the palpable weight of the battle's end. Jedediah leaned against the horse trough, the pain in his arm a dull, throbbing ache, but it was a grounding sensation, a reminder that he was alive, that they had prevailed. Elara, her hand surprisingly gentle but firm, was already tearing strips from her petticoat to staunch the bleeding. Her touch was professional, yet deeply personal. "We need to get this cleaned and bound properly," she said, her voice a mixture of concern and a newfound confidence. Lily and Tom, coaxed from their hiding place by Mrs. Henderson, ran to their mother, their small faces streaked with tears and dirt, but their eyes wide with relief as they saw her, and then Jedediah, alive. They hesitated before Jedediah, then young Tom, emboldened, reached out a small, grimy hand and touched Jedediah's good arm. "You saved us," he whispered, his voice full of awe. Jedediah looked down at the boy, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He gently ruffled Tom's hair. "We saved each other, son." The townsfolk gathered around, no longer a fearful, scattered mob, but a community tentatively reborn. Mr. Abernathy clapped Jedediah on his good shoulder. "We owe you, Thorn. We owe you more than we can say." Mrs. Henderson was already directing willing hands. "Someone fetch Doc Miller. And bring water, clean cloths." Sheriff Miller, his badge seeming to shine a little brighter in the dim light, hauled the wounded and cursing Silas Blackwood to his feet, assisted by 2 deputized citizens who now looked Blackwood in the eye without flinching. "Your reign's over, Silas," Miller stated, the words carrying the weight of a long-overdue justice. "Redemption's gonna breathe free for a change." Blackwood spat at his feet but said nothing, his face a contortion of pain and impotent fury. Later, after Doc Miller had cleaned and stitched Jedediah's arm, declaring it a clean wound that would heal well with rest, Jedediah found himself on Mrs. Henderson's porch once more. Elara sat beside him, nursing a cup of coffee he suspected was more for his benefit than hers. The children were asleep inside, safe and sound, their bellies full, their nightmares, perhaps for the first time in a long time, held at bay. The town was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not the silence of fear, but the peace of a storm past, of a burden lifted. "They want you to stay, you know," Elara said softly, looking out at the street where lamps now burned with a more cheerful glow. Sheriff Miller said there might be a marshal's position opening up for the county. Or just a place. A place to be. Jedediah looked at his bandaged arm, then out at the town. He had ridden into Redemption a haunted man, seeking nothing but to pass through. He had found instead a reflection of his own past pain in Elara's plight, and in defending her, he had inadvertently defended himself from the ghosts that rode with him. He hadn't erased the sorrow of Sarah, Martha, and Caleb, but he had honored their memory in a way that soothed a small part of that old, aching wound. He had stood when it mattered, protected those who needed it, and in doing so, had found a measure of, not forgiveness, perhaps, but acceptance. Redemption. "What about you, Elara?" he asked, his voice quiet. "What will you do now?" She smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that lit up her face. "Raise my children. Rebuild our lives. Thanks to you, we have a chance." A real chance. She paused, then met his gaze directly. "We'd like it if you stayed, Jedediah. Lily and Tom, they've taken a shine to you." "And I?" She hesitated, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "I value your company. Your quiet strength." Jedediah considered her words. The open road had been his only companion for so long, his grief a solitary burden. But here, in this small, dusty town that had found its courage, with this resilient woman and her bright-eyed children, there was a different path. A path that might lead not away from pain, but towards a new kind of peace, a shared future. He thought of the empty chair at his campfire, the solitary meals, the nights filled with memories. Perhaps it was time to build something new, instead of just running from the ruins of the old. He looked at Elara, at the hope in her eyes, a reflection of a nascent hope in his own. "Maybe," he said, the single word carrying a world of possibility. "Maybe a man can find a place to rest his hat after all." He still had a long road to true peace, but for the first time in years, Jedediah Thorn felt like he might not have to walk it alone. The night was calm, the stars bright above Redemption. A tyrant was caged, a community was healing, and a stoic protector had found a flicker of solace, a chance to nurture life instead of just mourning its loss. The debt paid in the town square was not the only one settled. The greatest debt, the one to his own spirit, was finally on its way to being reconciled. If you were Jedediah, having faced your past and found a chance at a new beginning, what choice would you make? Would you stay in Redemption, or would the call of the open road, the habit of solitude, prove too strong? Tell me in the comments below what you believe true redemption means. And if this story of courage and second chances moved you, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more tales of the West, and click the notification bell so you don't miss our next story.